Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my NACL Week number 2 overview and analysis video here in the Summer Split. We are getting into the thick of things now. We're really starting to get a good idea of where these teams are landing. Of course, we still don't have a full picture, but at least by the end of this week, we are going to have seen every single team play at least once. There is certainly some fun series to talk about, some fun teams and just narratives to analyze, because I think there are a lot of fun conversations to be had about the NACL right now, so I'm excited to get into all of those in this video. If you are excited, of course, let me know down in the comments section below. If you want to know my thoughts on week number 1 or my preseason thoughts on all of the teams in the league, you can check out the playlist up in the iCard right now. Definitely recommend it, but not require viewing for this video because we are going to be going over all of the week 2 games. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. I don't want to waste too much of you guys' time at the start. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series, and at the end of the video, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10 at the end. In the NACL, it's all really just about expectation and about growth, and so those power rankings are a bit more of a guide than they are in a lot of other regions, more than they are like concrete, this team is definitely better than this team. It's more so kind of just a projection in my eyes, and you know, we talk about that in some other regions, but it definitely applies a lot here to the NACL as a disclaimer that I like to put at the beginning when people actually watch the video. So with that out of the way, it's time to jump into the actual analysis, and that means starting off with day number 1, and we kick day 1 off with the same thing that we kicked day 1 off with in week number 1, and that's a Dragonsteel victory. It's Dragonsteel taking on CCG Esports. And like I said, they are going to be able to pick up the 2-0 series win. CCG gave it a good effort. I do think that they made some of these games relatively close. In game number 2 in particular, they had a couple of things going for them. Perhaps the Viego could get some resets and start to take over these fights. You had a Jinx scaling into the late game. It just wasn't enough. Dragonsteel right now is pretty clearly the best team in the NACL. Them taking down FlyQuest last week in their first series was definitely an eye-opener, and until they prove otherwise, they are going to be the favorites this split. And I do think that they look incredibly dominance. Like, they look talented everywhere. That's the big problem, is that when you're looking at this team, where do you see the weakness? Where do you see the part of the team that you can exploit if you are an enemy team? I think, generally speaking, I think a lot of people were looking at Zamudo as potentially being that on the top side over the course of this split at the beginning of the year, but it's only really because he doesn't have the experience. He's never really played for a top-tier team at the Tier 2 level, and so you just didn't know if he was going to be consistent enough on a game-to-game basis, because he wasn't really all that consistent when he was on other teams, but you know, the talent is showing through. He's having an amazing start to the split. This series in particular, maybe the best I've seen Zamudo play at the NACL level. He really dominated. He's not going to get player of the series for me. That's going to go once again to Yuji, just like he got in week number 1 for their win over FlyQuest. He is just looking amazing. He has, you know, followed up on that phenomenal MVP caliber spring split with some awesome starts here in summer. We always knew Yuji was going to be a difference maker for this Maryville team in spring, for Dragonsteel here in summer. We know he's one of the most talented players in the NACL. That's never really been all that up for debate, and you know, I'll give Chad credit. He played really well in game number 2. He was kind of their win condition in game 2, but Yuji was just so far ahead of the curve in game number 1 and really just was in a very good spot. He plays these AP carries very well. He's very used to being kind of a resource carry for his teams, and so he fits into this meta in a really proactive way, and generally speaking, he is, like I said, a lot better than a lot of the people that he's playing against. He is an LCS caliber jungler in terms of the skill set that he has. He proved that last split. He's proving it again this split. He's a big reason why Dragonsteel is, in my opinion, one of the most consistent teams in the NACL. But again, you have to give a big shout out to Zamudo on the top side, who was sensational in this series. Crimson is new to the NACL, so I'm not going to say this is the hardest matchup in the world, but one of the big concerns with Zamudo was, can he game to game be the top side of the map that Dragonsteel and Maryville had in spring? Can he be what Niles was, which was this super stable, very reliable, at times carry for this team? Zamudo's been very good. He's had very high highs in the past in the NACL for teams like, you know, Wildcard and AoE and, you know, all the teams he's played for, but he's never really been able to, you know, pin it down on a game-to-game basis. He's never really been able to be consistent. When he loses pretty hard. That is kind of the case for a lot of top laners in North America, but it is more the case for Zamudo, and that's why I was a bit, you know, not concerned, but it was a wait-and-see approach for me with him joining Dragonsteel. So far, so good. I mean, this was a phenomenal series. That Twisted Fate in game number 1 was exceptional. That Udyr in game number 2 was also phenomenally good, and so I'm really excited. I'm really happy to see Zamudo kind of living up to the mechanics mechanical prowess that we always knew he had. He's always had it in him to be a top 1, top 2, top laner in the NACL. That's the kind of talent that he has individually as a player. I think he just needed to level up in terms of the game-to-game, and that seems to be happening now. Spyrax, Jerry, Zyko all looked really good. Jerry is back in here for this team. Rockboom did a more than good enough job in week number 1. Getting that win over FlyQuest is huge with the substitute bot laner, but Jerry and Zyko as a duo, of course, offer essentially the best bot lane in NACL kind of energy, and so you're happy to get that back in. They were phenomenal in spring, and they were really good in this series. Jerry going deathless throughout both of these games is incredibly impressive, even if he wasn't the most aggressive player in the entire world. Zyko was very good as the engager. Spyrax did a really good job cleaning up fights, especially in the back half of game 2 on that Corki. Just really a good series overall for Dragonsteel. I'm not going to try and pretend this is shocking in any way. I like CCG. I think they're better than their record would indicate right now, but Dragonsteel's the best team in the league. This is not an upset by any means. For CCG, on the other side, like I said, I do believe that their record is not indicative of the skill level of this team. I think they are better than that. They've just played a couple of really tough teams, Supernova in week number 1, Dragonsteel here in week number 2. These are genuinely good teams. The NACL is just very difficult in the middle of the standings to kind of break through right now, and CCG feels like, at least in my opinion, the best of the rest, which is unfortunately why they've landed at number 7 in my power rankings. I think this was a good example where they do have things that they can kind of hang their hat on. I think they actually played a little bit better in this series than they did in week number 1, at least around the board. I think Chad was really good in that second game, even if he was caught out and overextended a bunch on the Talia in game number 1. I think Manui was a little bit more stable. He did go back to the 80 carries, no Senna Ornn in week number 2 here. Definitely something to continue to monitor if Manui is going to play these late game scalers that have become super popular in North America, like Kai'Sa, like Jinx. We've seen Zeri, Smolder even. These are the champions that have gained a lot of priority and popularity specifically here in North America. So, if Manui keeps going to that, hopefully that ends up helping his style. I think Shochi was generally fine here. He's always played well into Spyrax, but Spyrax is really good, and Shochi had a hard time kind of getting in and making a huge difference. Unfortunately, dead of the series, though, like I said, is going to go to Crimson on the top side, who just wasn't very good, especially in that game 2 on the Rumble. It was a really brutal game number 2. Rumble overall, over the course of this week, honestly, really wasn't that good. It was very much a feast or famine pick in the NACL. We saw a couple of people pick up a lot of kills. We saw a lot of people pick up a lot of deaths on that champion, and, we'll continue to talk about that as we go along, but this is far from the only Rumble game that I'm looking at from week 2 and saying, like, well, what exactly happened here? The Yasuo as well in game number 1 is the counter to Twisted Fate. We've seen this elsewhere, but it just didn't quite work. Zamudo was just more valuable to his team. He was a little bit better on the top side. Crimson's new to the NACL. I'm not going to, crucify him for one bad performance, but I do want to see CCG actually go into a team that's kind of below them in the standings. It's been tough to evaluate how good this team is because these players have been losing, yes, but they've been losing to teams that they probably should be losing to in terms of expectations. I want to see what happens when this team goes up against, one of the bottom 3 teams that are kind of a little bit on their level in terms of the expectations going into the split. For now, I'm not going to panic about an 0-2 start. I'm certainly not going to panic about an 0-2 series here to Dragonsteel, who is likely the best team in the NACL. Again, this team is dominating right now, 4-0 to start off the split. Yuji looks amazing. He's picking up right where he left off, and Zamudo is really killing it on the top side. If all of those things continue to click, like I have faith about Spyrax, I have faith in Jerry and Zyko. Anybody who follows the channel already knows that. If all of these things continue to click, it's not going to be particularly close at the top of the standings. And then moving on now to our second series here of day number 1, and it's the debut of a team that did not get to play in week number 1. It's Blue Otter taking on AOE Esports, and the Otters are going to pick up a very big victory in their first series here in the NACL. Congratulations to this team. Congratulations to the org. I think they've been doing some really good work over on Twitter, on social media to get people hyped for the split. I really like the team that they ended up bringing in here to the NACL. A lot of young players, a lot of inexperienced players at this level that have been waiting to get an opportunity, quite a few of them qualifying with the Otters, up through the qualification series, and so really excited to see what they can do over the course of this split. They were really good in this first series. AOE, a pretty good first challenge because this is a team that, does have experience. Most of their players have experience at the NACL level, but they're not stars by any means. This is not a team that's going to be competing for top 5, and so Blue kind of getting tested after that game 1 loss, but they bounced back really, really well, and honestly, games 2 and 3 were very clean. They were the better team by a considerable amount over the back half of this series, and they were even in game number 1. So I think there are a lot of good takeaways here for the Blue Otters, but talking about the player of the series, that to me was pretty easy. It's going to go to Samikin in the mid lane. He had a phenomenal series overall. Games 2 and 3 in particular were exceptional from him. The Hui, the Orianna, I think at times he's going to go a bit under the radar because he isn't the flashiest player, or at least he wasn't in this series. Levitate was popping off on the Kai'Sa in the back half of some of these games. Music, Quacker, even Rovex with a couple of the engages, they were all kind of stealing the spotlight. I think at times Samikin wasn't exactly the most eye-catching player throughout these games, but he was certainly the one that I think had the biggest impact on the game overall, and we were talking about that when it came to Blue at the beginning of the split when we were in, the preseason, and we were talking about where I think these teams could go right or wrong. Samikin was the player that I highlighted is the one I was most excited to see play at this level, and he did not disappoint in his NACL debut. I'm very excited to see if he can keep this pace up, because this was a very good debut series, even, after game number 1. Game 1 was fine. Cupik was really good in game number 1, which we will talk about, but Samikin was really, really good in games 2 and 3. Definitely outplayed him in the back half of this series. Of course, you do have to give a shout out to everybody else on Blue who played very well over the course of the back half of this series. Levitate was great, especially in that third game on the Kai'Sa. It was really fun to watch him win those late game team fights after Blue had gotten a pretty big lead. Music and Quacker on the top side, I think, were both very good. NXI was pretty strong in game number 1 on the Viego, a pick that we've actually seen do very well at the NACL level, but Music was doing a good job to be able to kind of pull that back. I think he played a lot more aggressive in the back half of this series, got some early leads, and really allowed the rest of the team to be a little bit more one-on-one or 2v2 oriented, which I think helps because you have someone like Quacker in the top lane who is talented enough to be able to go toe-to-toe with basically anybody mechanically. We've always known that. Again, he's another player similar to Moose Hater on the other side of this, similar to Zamudo, who we already talked about, who can be a bit feast or famine at this level, who can have really great games and also really bad games, but these were some really good games from him. The Gwen in game 3 was fun to watch. Levitate, Rovex, they were good as well. Blue was just really solid here. The Otters looked good, and I'm excited to be able to say that. For AoE on the other side, they didn't look quite as good, and honestly, I'm starting to get a bit concerned with this team. I'm not sure that they are going to be a top 8. It seems like they might be bottom 2. I know a lot of people had them predicted in the bottom 2. That seems to be kind of the direction they are heading. They have good moments. Game number 1 looked good for them. It wasn't the cleanest win in the entire world, but they were able to get it done. Cupik in particular looked really good on the Anivia. I think NXI had a couple of really nice moments on the Viego as well. They got the Skarner. There were a lot of things going for them in game 1, but games 2 and 3, things just kind of fell off. And honestly, dud of the series was a little bit difficult for me to decide. I landed on Breezy, but that almost feels like a cop-out because Breezy really wasn't all that bad in the last 2 games. The worst player on this team in the last 2 games was Cupik in the mid lane, on the Seraphine, on the Syndra, in particular in that third and final game where he really just got outplayed by Samikin on the Orianna, but he was the best player in game number 1, and that does make it a bit more difficult for me to look at him as the worst player across this series because, it's a judge of the series. It's not just a judge of who was the worst in game 3, and so, it was a bit of a difficult decision. I decided to give Cupik some grace on this one because he's a new player and because he was so good in game number 1. I'm gonna give dud of the series to Breezy, but again, if you wanted to give it to Cupik, I completely understand because he was really bad in the back half of this series, but Breezy just didn't really accomplish all that much. I don't even think he was really all that horrible. He just didn't really do anything. He wasn't a huge part of what AoE wanted to do in terms of their, aggressive plays, and he certainly wasn't stopping anything that Blue Otters were doing. I think Levitate and Rovex were definitely more valuable and definitely a little bit more proactive than Wixie and Breezy in the 2v2 on the other side of this matchup, and so Breezy is unfortunately going to get it. That's the second week in a row that I feel kind of bad giving dud of the series to an AoE bot laner. It's just unfortunate that it's happened 2 weeks in a row, but this team has a lot of problems. Again, Cupik was not very good in the back half of this series. Neither was NXI. It felt like he wasn't very comfortable in the Maokai in game number 3. We know he's a bit more of an aggressive player, and we saw that. I think when he went to a tank, Moose Hater was definitely just on the top side, like he existed. I like the Alawi. I think in Fearless, someone like Moose Hater could actually do relatively well because of those counter picks. Somebody who is known for his, more eclectic champion pool a bit more than the other top laners. And so, things like Alawi could be pulled out and could potentially be a bit more interesting. But someone like Cupik also has that kind of weird champion pool, but it's a little bit more limited. We kind of saw that in this series once he was pushed to things like Syndra that are a little bit more meta here in game number 3. It didn't work out nearly as much. You have Lux banned in a lot of these games, and so, it's definitely going to be an adjustment period, I think, for AoE, but their flaws are definitely starting to show, and I think a loss to Blue is certainly not something that fills me with a ton of confidence, because Blue wasn't a team that was projected to do particularly well. They were last in my power rankings, at least in my floor rankings, coming into the year, and they did not look like they were the better team in this series, and so definitely on the lookout to see if AoE can improve over the course of this split, but Blue looks very good at the start of the split. The Otters look really solid. I'm very excited to see if they can continue this hot streak. We've seen teams that, have a bunch of new players, underperform at this level over the past couple of splits. It has not been easy to transition from tier 3 to tier 2 for a lot of these young players, especially if they don't have, a ton of veterans around them. But, Blue could be the exception. There are a lot of really fun players that have experience at this level, Quacker, Music, Rovex. They've played at this level, just not, they've never won like a ton at this level. And so I think Blue is one of those teams that I'm really excited to continue to watch and really excited to see them get a win in their first series. And now moving on to day number 2, and we kick day 2 off with a matchup between a team that looked very good in week number 1 and a team looking for a bounce back here after week 1. It was Team Liquid Challengers taking on Disguised, and DSG is going to get that bounce back. They're going to pick up the 2-1 win, and this is pretty huge for them. I think that there are a lot of positives to take away from this for DSG. They did a lot of things very well. I think their carry duo in this one was exceptional, and they really did step up and win a series that I'm not going to say was a must win. If they lost this, I wouldn't be freaking out, but it certainly is a nerve-calming win. It shows that this is not the same DSG team that was really struggling in the regular season in the spring split to really establish any sort of continuity. They get their full lineup back in here, and things end up working out, but I think Team Liquid honestly should be okay with this loss, and I know that feels like a weird thing to say, but for a lot of this series, I think you could make the argument that Team Liquid played better. I think the 2 wins for DSG were definitely close games, certainly not ones that were blowouts by any means. Team Liquid had the opportunity to win both of those games, and then TL's win was kind of a blowout. They had the most dominant game in this series, and so yes, you get a loss in the column, and that's not really an ideal outcome in the regular season when these standings matter so much, but I'm not really sure I feel a ton worse about Team Liquid after this series, so we'll go ahead and talk about that. For DSG, player of the series to me was a pretty easy choice. It's going to go to Tomo in the bot lane. He took over these fights. Both of the games that they ended up winning, he was the integral piece to win it, specifically game number 1. They do not win game number 1 without him popping off on the Kaisa. He really was the difference maker in that. Team Liquid played really well, I would say, in the first game of the series, and it really was kind of Tomo versus the world in a lot of those fights, and Tomo ended up winning a couple of hero plays, a couple of bad decisions from Team Liquid, fighting 5v3, putting themselves in some uncomfortable spots, allowing, DSG to just, out-mechanic them, allow them to grab their own lead and end the game on their own terms, and Tomo did a great job of that. This is the LCS caliber player that we were talking about DSG getting at the beginning of the split. We thought he was going to come in and just kind of dominate because he was so good in the LCS. I think he was underrated for how good he was in the LCS this past split. It wasn't necessarily there in the first series. It definitely showed up a lot more now that he got to play with Poom. That being said, I'm going to do the rare thing that I hardly ever do, especially in the NACL on this channel, and I'm going to give dud of the series to somebody on the winning team. It's going to go to Poom. Look, I get that, at times you're going to have to die for your team. I get that as Nautilus, as Ornn, as Poppy. Oftentimes you're going to have to be the one to go in, and you're going to have to be the one that ends up dying first in the fight to allow space and to allow opportunity for the rest of your team. It's basically your job, right? Your job, especially as, Nautilus or as Poppy in that final game, is to absorb as much CC as you possibly can and then just hope your carries can carry the fight, and that's what ended up happening. I'm not going to begrudge him from that, but there were a lot of plays where he died for absolutely no reason. This felt like a very slow start for Poom. He struggled quite a bit in the spring split as well. Really was not the player that I thought he was going to be coming down here to tier 2 after playing in tier 1 for, CLG and 100 Thieves and all of those teams for so long. We thought he was going to come back down and really just kind of prove that, that progression level that we saw out of him in the LCS could translate to a lower level where he could actually go and dominate. That didn't really happen. The bot lane was very inconsistent in spring when Manui was here, and now that Tomo's here, it feels like Poom really needs to get back on track. Honestly, Kitong in week number 1 was better than Poom here in week number 2. I don't think that will last. I imagine Poom will be just fine moving forward, but this was not a good showing from him. I think they won in spite of Poom, not because of Poom, even with Tomo being so good. I also want to give a big shout out to Young. I know we were a bit negative there, but Young was also very good in this series. Roamer was definitely the best player on Team Liquid. He was trying his best in a lot of these fights, and Young was keeping up with him. I thought he was just as good, if not better, than Roamer in a lot of these circumstances, and, Roamer was touted as this super mechanically talented player that was going to come in and kind of dominate the NACL by me and a lot of other analysts, and, he's not exactly done that. Players like Young have really shown that we have undervalued NACL mid laners here, domestic NA mid laners, and that has become very clear. Tenacity and Yukino were fine. I think they were better in the wins, but I don't want to take anything away from Jenkins and Keel, who were at times better than Tenacity and Yukino. I think DSG is very thankful that Tomo had a very good day. I think especially, game number 1, like this series could have been an easy 2-0 if the Kaisa didn't start popping off in the back half of the first game. So yes, they were able to win it, but there are still things I think they need to clean up. And then for Team Liquid on the other side, again, they lost this, but I don't know how bad you genuinely feel about that. Really, the worst thing about this is that it's a loss in the column. There really aren't a lot of concerning traits here. Like maybe you wanted to see this team be a little bit more clinical in terms of their execution. They made some poor decisions, especially in the back half of games 1 and 3 that kind of cost them their macro. Their just general playmaking decisions weren't always optimal, but those are things that I think will generally get better as the split goes along. You would hope that a team that stayed together as a group of 5 would already be there, especially in comparison to a lot of other teams that did make changes. But, you're not going to freak out over those not being there because the mechanical skill is clearly still here. Romer was really good in this series, and he has continuously been somebody that, mechanically speaking, can go toe-to-toe with anybody in the NACL. I think he could have a quad-like split if Team Liquid starts to figure things out. I thought Jenkins and Keel on the top side were fine. Spawn and Kim down on the bot side were fine. Again, their biggest problems in this series were just making bad decisions, and that's fixable. That's more fixable than feeling like you're a bit outclassed in terms of individual performances. That's more fixable than feeling like you just got outplayed on the day. And so, honestly, I'm not all that worried about Team Liquid. The 2-0 last week was very good. I know it was against a lower level of competition, but it still looked pretty solid, and this series didn't do a ton to dissuade my idea that Team Liquid's still going to be fine, and DSG still has a lot of things to figure out. It's very funny because DSG walks out of this with the win, but I don't know if I feel better about DSG than I do about Team Liquid after this series, just by nature of how it ended up happening. I feel very good about a couple of players on DSG, but for both of these teams, I think that they are going to be looking at this and not feeling super different from how they walked away from week number 1. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here, and it's another debut here at the end of day 2. It's Winthrop University taking on FlyQuest Challengers, and FlyQuest is going to pick up the 2-0 win. Winthrop not looking perfect in their first series, but it's against FlyQuest, who is one of the more dangerous teams in the entire league. I get that they went 0-2 in week 1 against Dragonsteel, but Dragonsteel's probably the best team in the NACL right now. I think FlyQuest is still trying to figure out what they want to do in the early game now that Quad is gone up to the main roster that Bradley is in. I like Bradley. I think he will be just fine in the mid lane for this team, but counting FlyQuest out after that first week would be a pretty ridiculous sentiment. This is not an upset by any means. I think Winthrop looked generally fine. Honestly, I don't have a ton of negative things to say about them in this performance because I think they did relatively well against a FlyQuest team that is just kind of better than them in a lot of different areas. But, coming off of that collegiate championship win, SLU, like the SLU players, they looked pretty good in this one, and really doubling down, 4 of the 5 being SLU players, I think really is a positive. I know I talked about it as if Sword was going to be starting in support. Turns out Skytech is starting. I think that that's better for this team to continue that continuity, but we'll get to Winthrop when we get to them. For Fly, on the other side, player of the series was honestly kind of difficult. I very much debated between 2 players. It was either Surdy or it was Sajed. I think it's whoever you think individually played better. I could really hear an argument for both, but I think Surdy had the more standout game in game number 1 on the Renekton. It felt like that really was a dominant performance. He really just destroyed Denethor on the Cassante in the 1v1 matchup. I'm not really going to blame Denethor too much for that. Surdy is the best top laner in the league by a pretty large margin. He's LCS ready. He's been LCS ready for a long time. It's not really a worry when it comes to Surdy, and especially because I don't think he was perfect against Dragonsteel last week. It's really nice to see him bounce back and look so good here in week number 2. The Vayne was still very good in that second game. He was definitely still useful. It wasn't perfect. He made a couple of positioning errors, getting caught out in the bot lane with that weird-ass play was definitely kind of funny, but overall, I think the Renekton game was the most dominant game that anybody on Fly played over the course of this series, and therefore Surdy is going to get my player of the series. I definitely considered Sajed, who was probably a bit more consistent across both games. I certainly think he was better in the second one, and he probably was the most valuable player in that second game on the Jinx. At least he was the one that was the most valuable, while also not giving over a ton of resources like Shaden did. We'll talk about him in a second, but Sajed was very good on the Jinx. He's become very consistent. A lot of people have him ranked as the number 180 carry in the NACL. I think it's a pretty valuable, or a pretty valid thing to put, I would say. He's just really, really consistent on a game-to-game basis. He might not have the same kind of highs that some of the other ADCs like Scary Jerry or Tomo have, but I don't know if he's ever really going to have lows for this team. I still like those other two just a tad bit more, but Sajed is right up there with them in that upper echelon. Chime also helps out with that a lot, because Chime is the best support in the NACL. He still is, even with a lot of other really good supports like Zyko at this level. I think Chime, has more than proven that. This guy's been very good at the LCS level in the past. We know what he can do. And Shaden was, Shaden. This was a pretty typical Shaden series where he makes a lot of these incredibly good plays. He's doing a ridiculous amount of damage. He's pushing his team forward, and it's at the cost of his own safety and, sometimes consistency in terms of some of these fights. It's just what you have to live with when it comes to Shaden. He was awesome last split. I think he was very underrated last split. He was somebody that I was pushing as an MVP favorite last split for a lot of the regular season. I didn't think I ended on that. I think I ended with Surdy kind of being my pick in terms of what I considered to be the most valuable prospect, but Shaden was certainly someone that I considered as an MVP caliber player, and he's going to have some bad moments as well just because of how aggressive he is individually as a player, but for the most part it's almost always worth it with his skill set. And then of course Bradley I think adjusted pretty well. Really like the Corki, the Ezreal. He didn't really have to do a whole ton here, and Darklings was generally fine in the other side of this matchup, but FlyQuest definitely got their momentum and their groove back in this one. And then for Winthrop on the other side, this was an expected outcome. I think they generally played fine, especially in the back half of Game 2, where they were looking to make a bit of a comeback. Unfortunately, I do have to give dud of the series to somebody, and it's going to go to Denethor on the top side, mostly for Game 1 on the Cassante. He made some plays on the Gnar in Game number 2. The scoreline is probably a bit worse than, the individual play would indicate. He was the one that was actually, trying to do things for Winthrop in that second game, but it was not a very good Cassante Game number 1, and I think in general, it just was a bit of a rough start for him in his first series here in the NACL. I think that there were definitely positive signs, though. I'm not going to harp on him too much here. I think Winnie also just died a little more than maybe he had to at times in this series, most of the time dying for his team's sins, but as Karthus, I think he took the passive thing a little bit too seriously, was, positioning a little bit too far forward in a lot of these aggressive engages, and was getting punished for it. Aaron down in the bot lane, also now stylized as Aaron instead of Aaron. That doesn't make any sense if you don't know what I'm talking about, but if you know what I'm talking about, it'll take some time to get used to for me, but Aaron down in the bot lane was fine. I think Skytech could have been a bit better. Skytech was okay the last time he played in the NACL. He certainly wasn't super consistent, and so excited to see what he can do. I think he's gotten better since then. I really loved watching him in collegiate during the CLOL championships the last couple of months, and so excited to see what he can do, but not a great debut. I think Darkwings was generally fine. Aaron was generally fine. Winthrop just felt like they were a little bit outclassed, and that's not their fault. This is not a team that's supposed to be competing on the level of FlyQuest challengers. It's a really tough ask. It's not quite like the Blue Otters getting AoE as their first series. This is a much different challenge in terms of a week 2 debut, and generally I'm going to save judgment for this team until we see more of them in the coming weeks. But for FlyQuest on the other side, this team is still very good. In my opinion, they still are a top 2 team here in the NACL. Just because they lost in week number 1 doesn't make me feel a ton worse, because they lost to probably the best team in the NACL at the moment. And so even with some stumbling blocks, I expect this team to continue to get better in terms of their communication, and they will almost certainly be a major title favorite as the defending champions moving into the back half of the split. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL Week 2 overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Of course, up on the screen now, the updated standings after 2 weeks of NACL action. Any ties are just going to be broken alphabetically. That's only the case in 2 different spots, 3rd and 9th place at the moment, because I, unlike Leaguepedia, actually do want to take into account game score. It doesn't seem like Leaguepedia wants to do that. They have all these teams just ranked off of series score, but I don't think that's how playoffs are qualified, and so I'm going to do it how I think playoffs are qualified, because that's what makes the most sense to me. So only 2 ties, but of course, on the right of every single team, you can see a couple of things. First, power rank. That's where I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 10, and changes how they have changed from last week to this week. So we can go over the risers and the fallers. 1 and 2 are going to stay the same for me. Dragonsteel and FlyQuest are the 2 teams to beat in the NACL, basically no matter what happens until they prove otherwise. And Fear didn't play this week, and so they're going to sit at number 3. They looked like the best team of that middle cluster in week number 1. I really have no reason to move them around. But the middle of the standings are going to change a bit. Supernova not playing is actually going to move up 1 spot to number 4, because Team Liquid lost this week, and I honestly don't feel comfortable with their macro, and there are just some things that I think they need to clean up. Supernova looked a little bit better in week number 1, so they're going to move up to number 4 for me. Team Liquid, though, only going to move down to number 5. This is definitely going to be a bit of a controversial opinion, but I'm actually keeping Team Liquid above DSG. I know DSG just beat them, but honestly, I feel better about Team Liquid coming out of that series than I do about DSG. I think that there was a lot going wrong for DSG, and Tomo kind of saved that series for them. I'm not sure if they're going to be as lucky in a lot of different circumstances, so at least for now, Team Liquid's going to stay at 5, DSG's going to stay at 6, CCG's going to stay at 7. They've had a really tough schedule. I get it that they're 0-2, 1-4, they're in last place, but they played some really good teams. I'm not going to entirely blame them for their losses so far. I still think they are probably the best of the rest, but the team moving into the top 8 is going to be Blue Otter. I do think that they have pretty clearly shown that they are the best of the bottom 3, at least at the moment. They might even be better than that. Who knows? The upside on this team is a little bit higher than maybe I was expecting. They looked great here in week number 2 in their first showing, so excited to move them into the top 8. That means AoE falls down into the bottom 2. They move to number 9. Winthrop moves to number 10. I don't think that's going to be shocking to anybody. They feel like the 2 weaker teams in the NACL at the moment, at least until, something proves differently. They have some time to kind of fix that up in the upcoming weeks. But those are my power rankings. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. Always happy to hear other people's opinions. But it's time to move into my player of the week and my dud of the week here for week number 2. Player of the week, it has to go to Tomo. He's going to get player of the week. He was the most valuable player to his individual team. He was super crucial towards this DSG win. And honestly, again, I don't think they win game game number 1 without Tomo popping off in the way that he did, it probably would have just been a 2-0 in favor of Team Liquid, which would have been a disaster for Disguised. And so for me, Tomo playing as well as he did actively got DSG a win, and that's about as player of the week as you can possibly get here. My runners-up, my honorable mentions, Surdy, the top laner for FlyQuest, had a pretty amazing series, especially as a bounce back to what happened in week 1 against Dragonsteel, and then Yuji. Speaking of Dragonsteel, he has been maybe the best player in the NACL through the first 2 weeks. He truly has been exceptional. He's really carried over that amazing form that he had in the spring split, and I'm excited to see what he can keep doing. So Yuji and Surdy are going to be my honorable mentions, and Tomo is going to get my player of the week, and unfortunately, dud of the week for me is going to go to Crimson, the top laner for CCG. Just didn't have a particularly good series against Dragonsteel. It's not an easy matchup, but Zamudo is a player that you could potentially take advantage of, and he had one of his best series in the NACL, and so Crimson really struggling there definitely stood out to me. I think that there were other options for this. Hell, I almost gave player of the week and dud of the week to 2 players on DSG, with Poom having kind of a rough series overall against Team Liquid, but I ended up settling on Crimson, and, I think he'll bounce back again, a new player to the NACL, not somebody who has a ton of experience at this level. I think it's going to be just fine. Also, a bit of a side note, shout out the NACL. They do a significantly better job than the LCS does at providing, actual media for the league. At the beginning of every single series, they have headshots or full body shots of every single player. I just want to say thanks for that as a content creator. It has been brutal having to use the same headshots of LCS players for the past, 2 years in a row now, because they just refuse to update them. And, shout out to the NACL for actually including some fun media there, but that's a little bit of a side tangent. That's the end of the video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the NACL on this channel, as I just said. We post about the LCS, but we post about all 4 of the major regions as well. That includes the LEC, the LCK, the LPL, every single week on this channel. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.